Now, chuckling over our own forgetfulness, which increases in time, as Billy Collins does, is one thing. When I can't remember a name or a fact, my own rationalization these days is that the retrieval mechanism is still operating. It's just that the database is so large that it's grown over the years. But true impairment of short-term memory is also quite real and often tragic, a challenge not only to those suffering from it, but also to their loved ones. Even more tragic is the progressive loss of memory, because with it, all too often, it seems like our very souls slip away or shrink, even as the body keeps on ticking. Since the soul, as Kierkegaard once put it, is simply the self relating to the self, in memory, in the present, and in some hope for a meaningful future. Not long ago, a dear friend of mine, a beloved colleague in the UU ministry, slipped into progressive dementia caused by vascular Parkinson's, a relentless series of small strokes, while he was also losing his sight to macular degeneration. Because of his diagnosis with dementia, David didn't qualify for physician assistance in his decision to say goodbye to this life while he could. Instead, he courageously chose to stop eating and drinking while his loved ones filled his last days and hours with poetry and with song. At the request of his widow, who had lost her first husband, the father of her children, to the war in Vietnam, I was the principal speaker at David's memorial service, so that his character, his courage, his integrity as a colleague, all through a career as a highly skilled interim minister, could be remembered. As Eliot puts it, this is the use of memory. For liberation, not less of love, but expanding of love beyond desire. And so liberation from the future as well as the past. And on this Memorial Day weekend, I'm struck that he goes on to say, thus love of a country begins as an attachment to our own field of action and comes to find that action of little importance, though never indifferent. From where I live in the Richmond district in San Francisco, I sometimes walk into the Presidio to an overlook above the National Cemetery there, where over 30,000 military personnel find their final rest. And the McLeish poem with which we began about the young dead soldiers who do not speak is inscribed on the low wall overlooking the cemetery. It became national after the so-called Great War in Europe that Woodrow Wilson called a crusade for democracy. But it already included some of the war dead who had gone to the Philippines to move that nation from Spanish colonialism to US imperialism. And others were African-American Buffalo soldiers, freed from slavery, only to be set to exterminating Native Americans in the West. The ironies of history. But most of the 30,000 died in what Tom Brokaw once called the good war, the one against fascism in World War II. Few visitors today, I think, probably remember much of this. Because one of the characteristics of our culture today is presentism, which has three aspects. First, a kind of generalized American form of amnesia. We don't like to look back. The past doesn't matter. Only the present and future do. History is bunk, said Henry Ford. Second, when we do wake up to the past, sometimes we judge it all by our present standards. And that That can do things like cause the school board in San Francisco to propose changing the names of 44 schools, including those named for Abraham Lincoln and abolitionist Unitarian James Russell Lowell, because they were not quite as politically correct as we think we should be today. This, third, what factor is that what matters in the present is only how someone might feel in learning about the past. And this, by the way, is the flip side of political correctness, now fully in operation in the state of Florida, thanks to Governor DeSantis, who wants no teaching about racism or other forms of oppression that might make a young person whose identity is tied to past dominance feel at all uncomfortable about the fact. What? This is like forbidding collective learning from the raw facts of history. And yet those who do not learn from history, as philosopher George Santayana once put it, are condemned to repeat it. Over the years, I've done enough pastoral counseling with individuals traumatized by abuse or silence or neglect and rejection to know that another poet, W.H. Auden, was right on when he wrote in his poem in memory of Sigmund Freud. He wasn't clever at all. He merely told the unhappy present to recite the past like a poetry lesson, till sooner or later it faltered at the line where long ago the accusations had begun, and suddenly knew by whom it had been judged, how rich life had been and how silly, and was life forgiven and more humble, able to approach the future as a friend, without a wardrobe of excuses, without a set mask of rectitude or an embarrassing, overfamiliar gesture. What is going on now in America, in my humble opinion, especially since the death of George Floyd and the rise of the Black Lives Matter movement, is an overdue reckoning with the past and a reparative use of memory. Perhaps its ultimate use, I would suggest, is for our nation to be able to be, quote, more humble, able to approach the future as a friend, without a wardrobe of excuses, without a set mask of rectitude. Some, of course, still think that it is our manifest destiny to bring liberty and democracy to the rest of a benighted world. As a German theologian fleeing the Nazis, Karl Barth, said on arriving in New York Harbor to a journalist who asked him what he thought of the Statue of Liberty. "I think that lady," he said, "may need some demythologizing." He knew how many Jews from his own country and the rest of Europe had been denied asylum here. And certainly the poem inscribed on the base of that statue about "Give me your tired, your poor, your huddled masses yearning to be free," should remind us this weekend of how many today are being unjustly denied asylum and sanctuary, and on a bipartisan basis, I might add. Why? I think perhaps because we no longer remember that we are a nation of immigrants, or have any shared understanding of our history as a sanctuary. My own maternal grandparents arrived here through Ellis Island, both orphaned in their native Slovakia. They met and married in Chicago just before World War I and had 4 children together. And yet by the end of the last great pandemic to strike our country, the flu epidemic of 1919, all 4 of those children were dead. My mother, born in 1921, was their testament of faith in the future. that life, despite its tragedies, is worth going on. She is also perhaps the product of their grief work, because that is another constructive use of memory. Just yesterday, I read a long interview with Henry Kissinger, of all people, who marked his 100th birthday yesterday. Now, I know many of us in my generation came to despise him as Nixon's advisor on Vietnam and the author of the secret bombing campaign against Cambodia. My own mother, who was, when I was a war resistor, named the two squirrels in her backyard who kept stealing the seeds that she'd put out in the bird feeder, Nixon and Kissinger. And I'm reminded how the great composer of satirical songs, Tom Lehrer, Vatican Rag, etc., said that he stopped writing satire when Henry Kissinger was given the Nobel Prize for Peace in 1973, 50 years ago, the year I was ordained. But I have to admit to you this. I liked his interview, as he recalled his own childhood as a Jew in Germany under the Nazis, and how all the way down to the present, he saw his own life as a continuous effort to prevent localized polarizations and prejudices from killing people, or at least minimizing them, to prevent proxy wars from becoming competitions for global dominance, and how his chief worries now center on preventing a global nuclear war between the United States and China, but also on how artificial intelligence, now so rapidly advancing, could possibly program mutually assured forms of destruction transcending efforts at human control. And so he called for it to be treated as demanding the same kind of controls that we put on nuclear energy. Needed lessons from a long life. I was glad he shared them. But as Tip O'Neill said, all politics is local, and so is history. So recently, I tried to perform a little duty for my fellow UUs in the Bay Area by publishing a book called A Religious Center with a Civic Circumference: Unitarians in San Francisco since 1850. What it shows above all is that the influence of our faith to have a real impact on peace and justice in the world around us keeps going up and down more than the trolley cars on Powell. By the way, they were invented by one of our own number. We were most influential, that history shows, during times of turmoil and rapid change. During the Civil War, when Thomas Starr King led the movement here and had a congregation that his successor said was more influential than the legislature in Sacramento. This summer, through Starr King School for the Ministry, I'm going to be teaching about this history in an online course which is open to all of you, about what we can learn from reviewing our past as a religious movement in this area, about our future, and even our present. Lately, I've also been consulting here with your leaders about your own congregation and its future, which I consider remains enormously promising. But it is a challenge that you won't have this year a full-time interim minister. Because, no fault of yours, this pandemic caused in our own ranks of ministry what our own version of the Great Resignation, which hit public education, and nursing, and social work, and many other helping professions. Many felt undercompensated, more critiqued than supported, and more inclined to try to join me in semi-retirement than to simply soldier on. I get it, although I keep saying ordination is for life. Retirement is just when they stop sending you a regular paycheck. This has led me to recommend to your leaders that this summer, starting with your annual meeting in just a few weeks, you work with a part-time consultant who's been trained in the arts of interim ministry, but who works with you only part-time, to do a thorough review of your own history, a congregational self-assessment of your strengths and weaknesses, opportunities and threats, especially your needs and expectations for future ministry. Now, memories in congregations notoriously differ, as do opinions. History is not singular. It is forever perspectival. So you will need someone objective to help you see patterns that may now need to be broken, to rejoice with you when you move back into your sanctuary, and to help you form achievable and developmental goals for the year ahead as you work with Reverend Tovis and perhaps other part-time contract ministers to discern the best path to a sustainable, longer-term future as a community. This summer, my own priority after my 76th birthday next month will be to work on another book. Something Left Over, a memoir of ministry. I hope to finish it in time for the 50th anniversary of my ordination, which falls in November. The title may make it seem like just a collection of memories that never quite fit into sermons, and it's probably that too. But it's also something more. The title comes from the fact that when I was in my early 20s, an African-American UU educator, John Eartha, may his memory rest in peace and power, influenced both me and my immediate successor as UUA president, Bill Singford, through a youth leadership development program called Homestead, where the assumption was that everyone, young and old, is capable of some form of leadership. Bear that in mind. Why? Because leadership is nothing more than having something left over after taking care of yourself, to care for someone else and for the causes and community needs that affect us all. So this is my final charge to you, my friends, on this Memorial Day. Make use of memory, but not just to remember hurts or disappointments. To remember, as Conrad did, opening our service this morning, how many blessings you've received through this place and through the years, beyond expectation. Remember those who, like my grandparents, grieved and yet went on, grateful for the basic gift of being itself, without whom we ourselves would not enjoy as we do today the precious yet fragile heritage of life, liberty, democracy, and deeper concern for others. And may we never betray that memory, the best that was in those who went before us, the ancestors who now breathe and have breath through us. So may it be.